Good morning. Good morning to you all. Welcome. How are you doing? Fine? Everything okay? We started a little bit later today, and that is good after 2 very intensive days already. But it also comes with a risk, because the night before, when you know that you have 1 hour extra in the morning, then you spend 1 or more hours in the evening, maybe. So everything is okay. Okay. This is the third and final day of our conference on digital faith formation in the digital era. And I learned an emoticon, something like that, because it's already the third day, the final day. If there are people that you still want to talk, if there are people that you haven't talked to, then there's one more day to do that today. Before we do that, there's a keynote lecture, and we invited Professor Sabrina Müller for this keynote lecture on Transcendence in your pocket. I look to my smartphone quite some time, hours, but I never looked at it as a gateway to the sacred. So we will learn about this more now in the next hour and a half. Sabrina Müller is a professor at the University of Bonn, a professor of practical theology in the Protestant faculty at that university. She is part of a team of 3 professors, together with Professor Bert Ruben from the Catholic faculty at that university, and with Professor František Štek from the Charles University in Prague. They also applied to our call for applications in the second cohort of our program, and they developed a project on storytelling, on influencing, and on theologizing with young people in the digital world. This project is still a work in progress, and we are exploring what they could offer to us. It is very promising because they have a kind of meta perspective as academics on the topic that we are dealing with. And they are also part of an international association for the study of youth ministry. So we have this worldwide community of academics that is also in a way linked to what we are doing here. There's much more to say about that, but I will now give the floor to Sabrina. I hope our technological support will work well, and I'm very confident because we checked it already. Professor Müller could not be here because she's in another conference. That's what academics do when they don't teach. But we are very happy that she is here with us, as real as she would be here in person. Professor Müller, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for your introduction, and I'm sorry to not be in Sarajevo. I would have very much enjoyed it, but glad to be here for this lecture. Just try to share my screen. Is it working? Okay, I think it works. So Transcendence in your pocket. In the next around 40 minutes, I will have some reflections actually on the smartphone, and then we can have some time for discussions. But a little bit of the background. I'm doing research on the question of digital religion and digital theology since 7 years. So we've been researching religious influencers, spiritual apps, the meaning of the smartphones, how do we do research in the digital, and so on and so on. And today I just try to bring a couple of the things and theories and findings as well together. But before I start, you might see, and one thing, I have quite a lot of text on the slides. You don't need to read everything. I will tell a lot or tell some stories about it. But if it's helpful, I can send you afterwards the slides, the PDF of the slides, only if that's helpful. So imagine your phone once just a tool for communication, becoming a conduit for mindfulness, meditation, and connection to something larger than yourself. I had a funny experience. I just wrote, yeah, half a year ago, I wrote two articles about the meaning of the smartphones concerning religion and spirituality. And so what we see is that the meaning of the smartphones do change a lot, and that there are as well some generation gaps. So then I sent in the article. It's a book article, and then I got an email back, and the editor is already a long retired professor, even before the boomer generation. It's like, no, that's just a tool. How can you say it's a portal to the sacred, and so on and so on? And I had all the footnotes right with the actual studies we had, but he was just so, that cannot be. He was so mad at me. And so I just sent an email back and said, you being so mad might as well be a question of generations. Because the younger the people get, the more the smartphone becomes an extension of yourself. And life without the smartphone is not even thinkable anymore. So that's what I said. Smartphones are a gateway to friendships, experiences, and so on. And they often blur the lines between technology and spirituality. And I will talk as well a little bit about that blurring line later in my lecture, because Marlene wrote as well that there were discussion about the online and the offline and so on. So, but first, just a general question and reflection again, and I guess you all know that, but sometimes it's good to just be reminded. What changes due to digitalization? I would say nearly everything changes actually, and often we're not even aware how much it is. But what's changed is communication and social interaction. Um, so we often communicate much more when you think about WhatsApp, for example, or on social media. We communicate more and faster. And when young people, or even depending on the age, we are in trains and looking into our smartphones, it's often not just, sometimes it's consuming, but often it's as well being in relationship. So the whole communication sector and social interaction sector has changed. As well, consumption and entertainment. When you think about how do you buy things, many people just order them online. Or how do we entertain ourselves? So we have, for example, Netflix and so on. And behind all those programs is as well more and more built an AI that suggests the things that you're interested in, the algorithms. What we have as well is the access to information and education is different now. When I teach my students about preaching, I often tell them, you don't need to stand there and give informations. That's not preaching, because people can all access those informations via their smartphone on ChatGPT in 10 to 20 seconds. What changes as well is how do we get to knowledge, and what's and to education, what's real knowledge. And people are much more in the mindset of lifelong learning, especially with all the digital courses, master and bachelors and so on that you can do globally. But we have more changes and as well challenges. The workplace changes. We have much more remote work, but as well AI, artificial intelligence, is shaping or reshaping the workplace. And in many areas, questions come up. When AI, for example, is writing the sermon better than a priest or a pastor, why should a person write the sermon? Or I don't know, I will not talk a lot about AI today because that would be a whole new topic as well. But I mean, maybe if you want to play a little bit, you can access AI Jesus. You log in, you enter into heaven through a door, there is music playing, and you can ask all your questions about meaning of life. But what changes as well is healthcare. There is telemedicine. There are data-driven diagnostics with big data that can be much more evaluated. So it's a greater efficiency. And that leads as well, not just healthcare, but the whole situation to question of privacy and security. Question of where are personal data stored, for example. That's the big discussion. We have just one example about TikTok at the moment with the data in China. But I mean, it's the same, like if we want in Europe, we can access our data from Facebook and Instagram. So we can access our data from the company Meta. But in the States, there isn't a law, so people can't get their data from that big company. And as well, politics and opinion building changes a lot because there is ways of micro-targeting, of AI calculating who is not yet convinced, who is unsure, and then really micro-targeting through social media to get those voters. So just to kind of show the whole picture, I would say the whole world is changing and many things in many things we don't even know that. So I've had discussion with people say, oh, AI is bad and I wouldn't use AI. And I had to laugh because already 5 months ago, even if you did not want to use AI, you use it around 20 times a day through apps or when you order a train ticket and so on and so on. Since I'm from Switzerland, I brought you just a little statistic about the internet usage in Switzerland. And that's as well something, I mean, that's clear to us, but what we see is that the internet usage has a very high percentage. And oh, I cut that off, I'm sorry. Here you see this green line here. Here on top, those are people between 14 and 24, I think. So we are at 100%. The smartphone, those is just the data from Switzerland, but it looks nearly the same everywhere. What we see is that when you just look at the smartphone, the 14 to 29-year-old use 93% already through the smartphone access the internet. Here 30 to 49, we have 90%, 77%. And that was the Swiss statistics, I think 1 or 2 years ago, it would even be much higher. What we see as well is that, for example, the highest use of smartphones, mobile devices actually is in Spain. We're at 95%, then Sweden and so on. Maybe you find your country there. But we're actually already quite high, except Italy is not so high yet, but maybe that comes quickly. So digitalization in general and the smartphone that becomes such a normal device that's always with us transforms a lot of things. When we look now more at the individualistic or at the individual, what happens there? It does change the world perceptions. So digital tools shape how we see the world and blur the boundaries between physical and virtual. It means as well that we as humans shape technology, but technology shapes as well us. We are not kind of, even when we say, oh, I delete social media on my smartphone or whatever, we are just shaped by technology. I mean, I don't know. I do see people in the room. I don't know if I see your hands, but who has the flight ticket to Sarajevo on their mobile device? Can you just quickly raise your hand? So wide allowed already. So that's why it changes, but it changes as well how we see the world and how we see connection. It changes, that's something I said with education, but it changes the access to knowledge. it fosters learning and information and misinformation. So one of the very important qualities for youth is as well, how do I know what's information, what's misinformation? That's what I already said, communication shifts. That our mobile devices shape a lot how we even connect to people, how we interact with people when we're away, but as well when we're home. I mean, for me, it's very normal to use WhatsApp, and when I meet up with a friend, we just write back and forth. Or what you see as well in studies is that people who live far away, for example, through WhatsApp, communicate more often and know each other yeah, quite well. And then they meet up just from time to time, but the relationships are more intense. Or maybe you're as well on Facebook or Instagram. My experience is as well that I know some people from social media and we're talking and following each other and having discussions. And when I meet that person for the first time in a restaurant or something, I don't have a foreigner in front of me. I have a person that I know. That means, and I already mentioned that, so the relationship structures are as well different now. And especially through social media, new forms of relationships are as well shaped. And maybe you already have, or you all have already started with the projects. And if you have some in social media, you see how the relationships change. The participation changes as well. People are used to actively engage, to like, to comment, to dislike, to follow, to unfollow. And sometimes I have to laugh. Who would be in a worship service, doesn't like it, and unfollow, so just walk out? But that's the participation that's different. So if I'm not interacting, why am I there then? And then we have the blurred boundaries between personal and public life. You see this, for example, in the question of religious influencing. That means our offline and online experience, they merge and they do create hybrid realities. I don't know, do some of you know or even have played, or maybe the children, Pokemon Go? I'm looking in that room. No Pokemon Go, people? Some know that game. Okay. That was the first one, and it's a very good example how those realities blur, because I mean, I played it because I wanted to see how it works. So I was in the city of Zurich. I had all the nice old buildings and churches around, and on my device there was the game. And often close to the old big churches, there were like those arenas where you could fight. So many people met in front of the churches because there is the arena and you got into contact with totally different people. Now I swapped to or changed to digitalization. Oh, no, all that, what I said, it's very important for the church. And just some two fun pictures. Digitalization and the church, that's a very famous picture. That was actually when Benedict was elected, 2005. It looked like this in Rome. And then 2013 with Franciscus, it looked like this. And if you look at the picture, it's crazy what just happened in the 8 years with mobile phones and devices. Or another funny example, that's the cathedral in Switzerland. Here we have the old stones, and then they made some new ones. And if you look closely, you see people on their smartphone, actually. So even in art, we see a change. That means it merges so much that we in research often talk about either hybrid life existence or post-digital life. And post-digital doesn't mean like digitality is over, but it means that it merges so much that online and offline worlds are no longer distinct. They are they merge together. So you cannot say here we're online, here we're offline. The digital realm is more than just media. So nearly everything we do when we buy tickets in stores and so on merges that. The post-digital focus on the user perspective. And that's an important thing. So when we talk about the church and the digital, it's often like digital church works this or church streams that. But as soon as we look at the post-digital, so at that hybridity, we take the perspective of the user. And from a user perspective, things merge. Yeah, let me go to the smartphone now because that's I would say the most important tool that leads to that merge of online and offline. So what we see in studies is that the smartphone has become an extension of the self and a constant companion in modern life. And there was a funny study, I think it was in the UK, with more than 1,000 students. And they asked the students, if the police can research your apartment, your flat, your house for 30 minutes or your smartphone, what can the police research? I think you can guess what nearly 90% said. They all said, please go into my apartment, flat, in my house, but don't look into my smartphone. So it's a very personal device. It blurs the boundaries. It challenges as well notions of self and identity in a post-digital world. One example there, there is the study, the global smartphone. And what you see in that study is that people start to exchange the word home with home is where my smartphone is. So home is not where my house or my town is, but where my smartphone is. Because with my smartphone, I have all the pictures, I have all the contacts, I have all the connections, I can pay, I can do everything. And what we see as well with the smartphone, that's why I use that word portal. It is a portal to relationships, but as well to spirituality. Want to look a little bit more into the extended self perspective of that smartphone. That made that older Mr. so angry when I talked about that extended self. What you see with the younger generations is that smartphones are more than just tools. They are really extension of the self. And it's the constant connectivity that creates a sense of that extended self. If someone loses or forgets their smartphone, they are totally lost actually in connecting, in buying things. I think I can skip that. So, what does it mean living in a post-digital world? We live in a world where digital technology and media are not separated from our lives. Post-digital is where digitalizations happens constantly and refigures how we think, how we see as well nature, how we interact, even in our leisure time. I don't know how often you have the smartphone with you and take pictures and so on, or make short videos and post them. So the post-digital world, and I would say when we think about being church in that world, is really a mixture of offline and online. So what does this make now with the church? I already mentioned a little bit the digital church and said, yeah, but the post-digital has the perspective of the individual. I want to switch to the history of the digital church. Many don't know that there is actually a long history of research and actually of churches trying out digital things. There is the research strand on digital religion and digital religious communities. One of the first researchers was Heidi Campbell, who started quite early to work on those topics. What we see is that since the late 1990s, or even beginning 1990s, religious communities started to emerge. And since the late 1990s, research started to emerge on digital and virtual communities. In the beginning, such communities were shaped by an email server that just sent out emails to all the people and all the groups. Or maybe some of you have been in blogs with chats, so they were shaped by chats. And the research strand of the digital church has undergone various different passages in its story. And I want to show you those passages because they are important when we think about when we talk about being digital church or being digitally active as religious people or with projects, because we see still different forms of the digital church, and we see all the different stages still now. So there have been early studies on online communities, and it was tried to understand that. And often there were the question, are those authentic communities? And that seems very interesting to me because we have late 1990s with the question, are those considered authentic communities? And we still have that question that comes up. But what was already seen long ago was that online communities allow members to form genuine connection and fostering a sense of belonging and shared values. So it was not just a substitute, it was a complement. I have to see. Yeah, what was important there is that it's still important with online communities that people meet with shared beliefs and as well shared values, because it's easier to like connect and disconnect. It has something to do with me if I want people to stay. Then what was as well and is still a topic. So we have here that people really meet digitally. And the other point is, and that was especially often the case during COVID, the media use of churches. And the media use of churches, now as well of parish churches, analog churches, has seen a high rise through COVID-19 pandemic. And I was in the leading team of a bigger study. It was called Contact Study, Churches Online in Times of Corona. It was a study with different denominations, and there we looked at how do churches and people reacted to that COVID situation. I think I didn't bring those graphics. No, I didn't bring them. But what was very interesting is that we looked at clergy in the first study we did and had more than 7,000 clergy. And many clergy from Catholic churches, Protestant churches in Germany, in Sweden, UK, and so on, said, oh, I felt encouraged to become more creative because there was so much not possible anymore. But the digital did bring a space. Clergy felt encouraged to become more creative in the digital sphere. So we have seen as well a high rise on streaming services and so on. And on the other hand, that's what I often tell churches, what we see as well and what we still see is that churches use social media like they used what's that, the English word? When you go to a church, in front of the church, there is this little cupboard with all the things that are going on that week or in that month. So churches often are still using social media just to post their events. And that's not the logic that works because social media, for example, has a relational component to that. And then we have the strand of digital ecclesiology, and that explores the essence of the church within a digital world. So it's more on theological question. It's on the question, can we talk about church? What are the criteria for it to be church, doing church online? And here we have as well a lot of discussion about Holy Communion online, faith. Even we've had looked at some ways of doing baptism in the VR environment, because that's already being done since a couple of years. And then searching back, we have the post-digital church, and that's the user-centered centric approach. And what we have there, so that's the one that just recently came up. What's highlighted there is that there is a shift from institutional perspective to individual experience. So here, when we talk about, is it church, digital ecclesiology, or here, how do churches communicate? We always have the institutionalized perspective, but with the post-digital church, we have more the individual perspective. This approach prioritizes the perspective of participants and examines church from their viewpoint and from their willingness to connect and disconnect. And yeah, when we adapt that perspective, we gain a deeper knowledge about how do people experience religion, spirituality in the digital, and how are they willing to participate, and what are the individual spiritual journeys. Because what's very interesting when you look at a young person, I mean, we often do look at Instagram, and that's the religious input, or TikTok, or AI Jesus, I don't know, whatever. But the interesting part is that as well, the whole religious and spiritual being of a person can be shaped through different apps. So I can follow a religious influencer, that will then be the next slide. I can follow a religious influencer on social media that gives some impulse. I have maybe a Bible study, Bible reading app that I share with friends, or I follow someone on YouTube. So there are all the different ways. I use a spiritual app to meditate, and so on and so on. So what we see as well when we use more that post-digital approach is that religious influencers become more and more important. And the interesting part is that they're often a bridge between institution and the individualized person. I've done studies on influencers since 4.5 years and worked with many influencers. And there is even still a growing trend in the German-speaking world. That's where our main focus was, on more and more religious influences. And the interesting part again there is that they are on Instagram, for example, but then they have a podcast, and they are guests in another series or with another influencer. What we still have is that the influencers are often church representatives when we look at influencers from main denominations, so like Catholic, Protestant. With free churches, it varies much more. But here we have still quite a lot of people who have either studied theology or did study theology, who are clergy, vicars, and so on. The online presence allows them to build a following and gain visibility with the public network. And I would say the influencers are part of a broader shift in how people engage with faith in digital age. But what seems very interesting as well is that when we put out like a religious, or when we have a religious influencer, it doesn't mean that this person can connect to everything. and everyone, because it's the same with religious influences as with other influences. We see the influencing theory is that always a person, when a person comes together with a topic, and it's felt that the person and topic feel authentic, then there is kind of this merge of those, the merge of those both of those two areas, where there is a way of meaning making and where people are more willing to connect. When we look at influences, there are different types of digital or of religious influences. These are the three categories that Heidi Campbell works with, but there are as well other categories. The interesting part is that we have the digital creatives, all of those, but some act more as digital entrepreneurs. Those are often more doing the technical stuff and are typically more often volunteers. And they are often have a passion for technology. So I was a pastor in a church for 6 years. And I had a guy who loved technology. So even before COVID and whatever, we streamed services and he taped and recorded everything and so on, just because he was such a technic freak. Then we have the spokesperson. Those are often employed social media experts that work for a given organization. They are skilled in communication and religious messages. And that's interesting because what we see too is that for a longer time, and people, those spokespersons have done that for free as a hobby or in their spare time. But there are more and more churches build more and more employment possibilities for people who work as in religious influences. And then digital strategist, individual with a religious calling or ordination, such as a nun, monk, or clergy member. They are actively involved in exploring implementing digital strategies for religious engagement. So more about influences. What's as well important is that church influences provide insights into everyday experience. And if that doesn't happen, it's often not very important or very interesting for the people. So it's like there was an old saying in German that said, in the vicarage, in the pastor's house, there is always a light burning. That was in the 50s. And then like in the 90s, 80s and 90s and so on, the discussion was there is no light burning anymore. So here it's again a light burning, but with the digital house of a pastor, a digital vicarage, or a religious spokesperson. Often influencers do act in their official capacity as clergy. It's very interesting that robes are used more, that they really play with being private and in my living room, for example, and still being a clergy or a theologian. So what you see there is, for example, the dog collar is much more used, and it's even used in traditions that doesn't even use a dog collar. They do pray and conduct devotions on Instagram or YouTube, and they post liturgical elements, but often as well private moments. And they talk as well about how do I doubt, what do I do when I'm afraid, and so on. Another important market that the church is still not really looking at a lot are religious and spiritual apps. And they offer, I use the term window of, it's like a window into the increasing diversity of religious practices outside of traditional institutions. There is a whole set of apps, and since 2015, more than 2,500 new religious and spiritual apps were created. The apps are again something that bridge the divide between online and offline worlds, and they do foster unique digital religious experiences. A few examples. I mean, there are apps from the different denomination, but the apps that are used most are not bound back to a certain denomination, but they are mindfulness and meditation apps. And only when you look at that, only in April, that was during COVID, we had with Calm nearly 4 million downloads. Headspace, another big one, 1.5 million. Meditopia, 1.4 million downloads. And there was just a new statistic that said in the States, every fifth person is already using spiritual and mindfulness apps and meditating with apps. I've worked longer with the app Evermore, done research, and then the multi-religious app Insight Timer. Insight Timer is as well a leading meditation app. But what's very interesting to me is that you can access hundreds and thousands of meditation, but you can as well participate in live sessions of spiritual teachers. And you can be in meditation groups or in spiritual topic groups where you can meditate together, you can discuss, you can talk, you can write short messages, and so on. And Insight Time is really a multi or a trans-religious apps. It does blur the boundaries. So I've participated in meditations where it starts off with it was a mantra that was sung, but the words were first from the Our Father in Heaven. Then it changed to some passages of Hindu mantra, and in the end, it came back to the prayer of Saint Francis of Assisi. So it does blur a lot those boundaries, and it creates a unique way of spiritual practice and spiritual experience for people who use that app. And what we see there is, and that's again not typical, very typical, if you have an individualized religious practice, religious apps and spiritual apps do transform religious practice because often they lead me, for example, through meditation. If you're German speaking, you can download the app Evermore. That's from the Protestant Evangelical Lutheran Church in Hanover. And it's kind of an everyday short meditation app, but in the background, there are actually the idea of the of Ignatius practices of spirituality. So that means when we use those apps, they shape how we practice religion, spirituality, and how we see the world. And that becomes very personal, fluid, and many of the apps more and more have built in as well an AI that suggests use this and use this meditation. And there is a greater interaction between religions and secular and sacred because it comes together. You see how many more slides? I have too many slides. So the outlook, the post-digital church. I think I will switch to something that's more important maybe for you. What becomes more important for the post-digital church is actually the user perspective. So the user perspective and the user experience is that what lets people connect or not connect. And that means as well that the ways of how people experience and live spirituality and can develop a lived theology becomes more important. What we see, if you want to categorize the things that I just said, is that with digital church and spiritual practice, we often have the institutionalized perspective. That was often what does the church offer? That was the streaming and so on that I showed you. Then we have the individual institutional perspective. That's what I told you about the whole question of influences. So often still individuals that participate in a or let's say influences that are clergy or participate in a denomination, but they're as well not just individual representative because they show a lot of their private life. And then we have the individual perspective or individual practice as well with all the religious apps. And there is no control of that. So when you look just at the graphic here, that's a little bit what you see. A lot of the research has been done here and a lot as well of what churches actually offer. I know it's German, I'm sorry. But we have an institutionalized church practice, and that's church often work in that setting. So let's stream a service. We do a chat for confirmants or people who get firmed. We have digital house groups around the church. We have this, as I said, individual religious practice. We have in that often the influencers, but we have as well, maybe you know, some of you in the German setting know the Netzgemeinde. That's a Catholic digital service. It's not just a service. You can join once a month a Zoom service, but it's as well like every day on WhatsApp, spiritual impulses, and you can do WhatsApp services yourself out in nature wherever you want. And then in this liquid practice, with all those spiritual apps, we have actually less church activity. Yeah. For churches, all that I said means that there is a loss of interpretive power. Because it becomes more individualized and the individual can look for their community and connect. Churches do lose the interpretative power of theology, of religious beliefs, especially with the example of like the trans-religious apps, as well of religious practice. How should that be? How do people do that? And the institutional significance. What can churches now do? Let me... Yeah, communication benefits as well of churches, and that's what they often don't look at, is through the digital, there is a global reach that wasn't possible before that. And that's often through networks and special people, events and services. There is as well a way of accessibility and inclusivity that's fostered through the whole question of digitality. What's as well is that there is a strong emphasis on digital community building with virtual communities of people who would otherwise not connect, and community building as well around shared interest, and diverse community with a bigger diversity. What's very important is I have this authenticity versus authority. What works in especially social media is authenticity, but authority doesn't work. And authority isn't that gives that's important for people anymore to follow. We have a shift as well in theology from deductive normative theology more to inductive approaches. So what we see in that whole development is that actually very contextual understanding of faith and theologies emerge as well in the digital. And that sometimes it emerges out of different small networks, and that it becomes as well an important way actually of being theology. What we see as well is that there is an individualized religious identity created and some challenges for traditional churches. The increasing choice is a problem, but I mean, it's in the digital world, it's normal. people choose their connection. People don't like the hierarchical structures, and when churches are structured hierarchically, it's a problem. And media influence shapes a lot of the opinions and the beliefs of people. So for churches, I would say it often means what Emmanuel Lorty says, that borrowed clothes don't keep you warm. Lorty says many individuals in churches and community of faith experience a coldness that originates from the structures in place that are borrowed, and as such are ill-fitting. These clothes either belong to a bygone era or else have not been developed in response to the felt needs and lived experience of the people themselves. So when we think about being church, it means as well to think about what are the right clothes that we need. Again, aspects for church development, and then I'm done, nearly done. What becomes very important is experiential theology. So people need to experience the things. Hybrid ecclesiology, so that church is not seen as a static institution, but as a lived and changed process as well. What's very important is that there are as well digital ecclesial spaces to connect, different one, not only social media. I haven't talked about VR a lot, but that has as well possibility. So, and that means that the core task is actually a meiotic practice. So meiotic is the midwife practice of people, of helping people in the digital find and develop their faith, help them with the everyday hermeneutics. It's an important religious communication on equal footing or eye level, because that's what people are used from social media, and empowerment of the people in itself. Then what's the task of the church? Or no, not what's the task, what's different now? Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury already said 20 years ago, what makes the situation interesting is that we are going to live with variety, and we need to live with that, but because we cannot get back. So what's the church's mission in a digital culture? I would say the church has a crucial mission to fulfill in this digital age. This mission involves making the message of Christ relevant to individuals in a world increasingly shaped by technology. In this digital age, the church must adapt and innovate to connect with people in meaningful ways. Its role is to share the hope and transformation found in Christ's message. So what means is that this understanding of mission is very momentum. It means, what does the promise of Christ means for the people in that moment, or in that individual connection? Because sometimes it's not, or often it's not a long-term connection on a long run. Yeah, I think I will stop here because I could go on for much longer on those topics. But I hope I could give you some insights about the post-digital church and about different ways of how people connect, interact, and think about being church.
Thank you very much, Professor Müller, for your contribution to our learning community. My experience was a very strange experience, because you have built upon things that we have touched in the last few days. You have given words to some of the things that we already were talking about. You widened the perspective with academic input. You widened the perspective with ecumenical input. So that was very intriguing. It was also thought-provoking, and there were new things like loss of interpretive power, or individual religious practice and experience, and so big changes, fundamental changes. You also gave us a new term because this conference was about youth faith formation in the digital sphere, but actually we should talk about youth faith formation in a post-digital world. So really interesting. For the next time we will take this into account. I'm looking into the room here to the participants of our conference. I hope you can also see them. And I'm wondering if there are questions or remarks or additions or nuances that you want to add. There are microphones on each table, so yeah.
No, my question is on the thoughts of the professor about also reflecting on yesterday's lecture about sociology from the sociological perspective. I'm wondering, when we are speaking about I don't know, our contemporary digital culture, the smartphone as an extension of the self, I wonder, because we are also living in a society that is very rapidly changing, and when I or somebody older than me, when also in the academical context is speaking about these things, I wonder if they are still relevant, because the way in which we use smartphones and the digital realm, I think it's not the same way as already the much younger generation is using it. For example, I don't know, I personally use the digital realm, digital way to encounter my faith in a much more, I would say, much more professional, intellectual, I don't know, way, whilst youngers use it they use it much more than I do, and they use it much more for fun. I don't know if they are searching genuine religious experience on the net. Because yesterday when we had this, I don't know how it's called, a round table with all the youth, I think they emphasized the digital realm more as a gateway, but then they also emphasized their own, as if I understood correctly, their personal need for more physical encounter. So my question is, if our vision of our digital and smartphone situation is coherent with the situation that is rapidly changing, and the fact that our experience is not the same with the younger generations. I'm sorry if it's too complicated.
I'm not quite sure if I understand your question right. I mean, oh, now I have a backlash. I can hear myself. Okay. So I'm not sure if I understood the question right, but for me it was interesting to how you told what happened yesterday, because I wasn't there. I would totally agree that young people already use their device different. And I would say it depends as well on the age, but we use it sometimes more intentionally. But as well, as I said, the old generation, like the boomer generation, would use it as a tool, as where my generation already uses it more than just a tool. It's more an extension of the self. So the question is, I mean, do young people access the internet or social media to get religion? That's an interesting question. I would say not necessarily, but they come across religion on TikTok and Instagram and so on. But what we see as well is when they're interested, they do ask like ChatGPT, or they do use or download religious apps. I mean, that's what we see with the whole download quote of religious and spiritual apps. So there is a need for mindfulness, meditation, better sleep, and so on. And that's not just older people who download spiritual and religious apps. So I would say there is the need for spirituality and religion is there, but it's much more individualized, it's much more fragmented, and it's often much less associated to a special institution or denomination. That's maybe as well something that I didn't even touch today, but many of the religious communities that we've looked at are often, I would say, post-denominational. It's a mix of Catholic people from the Catholic Church, from Protestant churches, from free churches, Methodist, and so on. So for those who are in the German-speaking section, if you look at Brot und Liebe, so bread and love, they have an Instagram account, but they have as well a Zoom service every month that's post-denominational.
Okay, thank you. There was a question from one of our Ukraine projects. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. And I have a question about our Ukrainian context, because when the first conversions started, many of Ukrainians went to Europe and around the world, and we see how the digital realm and post-digital reality helps, because people can be connected with their Ukrainian friends who are staying there. So there's a great communication, and it gives a lot of benefits, as you said, about ecumenical, about connection of those who are living in Europe and those who are staying in Ukraine. And I have a question, I have thoughts about I don't know how to say it, threats that it could bring, because sometimes Ukrainians who live in Europe, they can be a part of some European parishes, for example, Polish parishes, and in Ukrainian. And in Ukraine, we have a phrase you can be everywhere and nowhere because of the digital world, because they can be a little bit in a Polish parish or any other, and they can be online in Ukrainian, but in the end, they aren't uprooted. They didn't have their foundation, because it's only an online communities. So how what advices you would give on that? Thank you.
I would question the sentence first, or if they're not rooted, because when I look at the example of Brot and Liebe that I just mentioned, people from that online community would see that very much as their church, and it's very important to them. And so they're very much rooted into that church practice and community and discussions and so on they have. And I think that will even increase, people don't necessarily stick so long to one thing or the other anymore. I mean, we have less and less parishioners who stick to that parish, because we're so used to, I take again the smartphone, I can follow and I can unfollow. And that's not just a saying about on Instagram, for example. That's what I mean by technology shapes as well our individually. When I experience often, I can get that access, I can follow that and unfollow if I don't like it anymore. It means as well, it makes us quicker to unfollow churches or a traditional church where we've been to before that. And as well, the example that you brought, people are there and there or neither fully, I would say that's as well, it's a mirror how society is. And I doubt that churches can really change that. What I see, but that's more from the German-speaking perspective, the less reputation churches here have a state church anymore. I mean, I think in Switzerland we will lose that in the next 20 years, being a state church. And I think the Catholic and the Protestant church will lose that. The more the church needs to rely on those people who say, I'm really part of that church. Maybe one thing that I see too, and for me, that's very interesting. We do research at the moment in churches that are parish churches, but on the same time work as well with digital tools and meet digitally to strengthen the community. So it's both and for me that seems as well interesting examples there. So it's like a pastor who uses before Easter this and this meditation app with all the congregants that wanna use that, and then they have a Signal or a WhatsApp group where they exchange every day, and then they meet weekly 4 times before Easter. So this hybridity even increases in parishes.
Thank you. Other questions? Christine? Phone there on the table. Yeah.
Dr. Mueller, thank you very much for your inputs. You mentioned that authenticity is more important than authority, and I'm wondering if you can give some examples of that, of what you've seen in your own research. How does that manifest itself in the digital context?
That's especially important when we look at religious influencers, actually. So no, it's not even that. Let me give you a very practical example. I've looked at the Evangelical Lutheran Church, the Nordkirche in Germany. And they have the bishop, and she, I looked at that 1 year ago, so I need to give you that number. But she had close to 8,000 followers on Instagram. And then there was a young pastor in a very rural parish, but she has more than 40,000 followers on Instagram. And that means in the end, she has more form of power and authority. And that means as well, power structures in churches change. So what we see then, or what we saw then, is that this young pastor was elected in the EKD Rat. So the Evangelical Church of Germany has this leading team of 12 people, and she was voted as one of those persons. And normally, like 10, 15 years ago, you only had bishops in there, or people who have been former professors or still are professors. Now we have an influencer in that very important position. And it means as well that one part, and it means as well that not, for example, I take the dog collar again as example, not because you wear a robe or because you're like an ordained, have the sacrament as priest or an ordained pastor, that gives you authority on Instagram. It gives you how you live your faith, connected to your role as a person, connected to your everyday life and to your doubts and problems and good moments and so on.
I have a quick follow-up. In the Protestant context, have you seen examples of where the juridical accountability lies? So if that young pastor, that young woman is liked, what makes her authentic? In other words, what's the metric we're using for authenticity? And then where does the accountability lie within the institutional framework, if any at all exists?
It doesn't exist. I mean, what's interesting, I've looked more at Protestant influences, and what you see is that often like people who study theology or are ordained work as well as influencers. And they're still, because they're ordained, they connect themselves very much to the church. That's what you see as well. They don't promote products like other religious influencers. So they don't do that. So I would say it's still there, but it's much looser, and especially with religious influencers who are not, or spiritual, who are not connected in a way of ordination or studying theology, it's even more looser. We have example of quite very fundamental free church influencers, and they are not held accountable by anyone. They don't have to. And then the question of authenticity is a very hard question, but it's that what I didn't bring that graphic because I can so often show it on one graphic. Authenticity is really what people see of the person. I mean, you don't have to show everything, but the person has to feel real. That's her or his character. And then what they are, and then what they do. And if those fits together, it gives a feeling of authenticity. Let me give you two examples. I've worked with as well a Protestant couple that's a queer couple of two pastors, and they live together, are married. And they are very famous on YouTube. And I've done research on them since 2020. And we've talked on WhatsApp and on the phone. And then last year, I invited them to the university. And when I saw them in person, I had the same people in front of me as I saw on YouTube. That's a form of authenticity. Doesn't mean you need to show your whole life, but you need to show you as a person and with your character. The same, another pastor that I looked at, she's a pastor in the rural area in Switzerland, like where you see the cowbells and so on. And her thing is, I'm a pastor in that rural area, and my house, the vicarage, is always open. And she can transport it very well into the digital. So people who look for a traditional vicar or pastor, rural pastor, connect to her, even if they're not from that area. But it always means I need to show part of me and my character. And it needs to fit together with the meaning I bring in as this person. I'm a traditional parish pastor, or the other two, we are two queer pastors married and being pastor in the church.
Thank you. I want to go to the other side of our conference room, to Paris, actually.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for the talk. I understand that you were talking from a scientific point of view, but I wanted to address a more normative question. With science on cognition and cognitive sciences telling us more and more about religious experience from a brain point of view, and with the growing capacities of digital technologies like VR to create very intense sensory experiences, I wonder how we can leave space for God, and how we can avoid to be stuck in a sort of consumption of religious experience that could be overly exciting or overly strong because it's been created by technology. And I don't know, I feel like maybe silence and nothingness and the silence of God and struggling with void is part of the spiritual experience. So I wonder how we do that with technology.
I mean, that's a huge question. I've done research on religious experience for 5 years. So I have a book on that. It's called the Transformational Religious Experience, and it's Transformational Power, and it's open access. And I've worked with young people on religious experiences. For me, the interesting part is that they don't talk about consumption. They often talk about very relational moments. So that's one part. I'm not so afraid of that. What you see with the consumption more is in the charismatic and Pentecostal movement, where you need the kind of the kick of the experience. That's what's more often. Now what you're saying with technology, I would say we have again both. You can have authentic religious or spiritual experiences, and you can have the consumption. And you are right, with VR, the emotions are so intense. But when we look at like meditation apps, you have as well the quietness and the struggling and so on. So I would say technology, maybe many of what you describe, it's already there, but technology maybe gives a push to that, or makes it even more stronger. But yeah, what I haven't come across yet is actually research on VR and religious experience and that kick that you describe. So I can't really say reliable something about that.
Thank you.
question from the Netherlands, and then a question from the Catholic University of Lviv in Ukraine. Yeah. Last two questions? 10:30 or 10 minutes? Huh? Yeah, okay. Martijn.
Okay, so thank you very much for the very exciting lecture. I wanted to talk a little bit about something you said about spirituality becoming more post-denominational. Now, this is, of course, very interesting because it suggests almost that, say, maybe we come from a particular intellectual tradition with certain theological foundations, and that these are perhaps less relevant these days. But I was wondering, does it also then not create a certain superficiality, right? Because as I said, in Catholicism, we have a very long and rich intellectual tradition. And all of a sudden, if that doesn't matter anymore because we're in a post-denominational world, I wonder what that really means. So could you comment on this issue of superficiality? Because a lot of young people also have a need for clarity and a need for clear rules. I think that's also what I see in my own church, in my own local church, is that a lot of young people come there and they like actually what they see in the Catholic Church because it's been so ancient. It's been around forever. And so I think they really like that. So what's your perspective on that?
Well, I can just describe what I see about the post-denominational, that I think we have both. And I've as well experienced as a parish pastor. I mean, sometimes I have people signing out of church, like a husband signed out of church for him and his wife. But his wife was actually Catholic. They could not sign out of the Protestant church. So I had to go back to them and say, well, I can sign you out, but not your wife. So I already saw more than 10 years ago that people don't even know what they are actually anymore. And in the post-digital, what I see is that people connect to the interests and to the experiences. So I would agree on that. The intellectual tradition, I'm not saying it's not important, but what's very important is actually the experiential level of religion. And what I do a lot of church consultations as well, or I did a lot before I became professor. And I often said, well, where can people experience religion, make religious experience as far as we can make them? We can't, but open up space for religious experience. And what we see as well, especially when you look at youth, if we don't have spaces to discuss that, talk about that, and process that, they kind of don't stick. So religious experience need a form of rhythmization, of like thinking about it, reflecting about it, and even talking about it. So I would say, and that's as well not the door, but that's as well the point where tradition comes in, and where young people do look for everyday hermeneutics. So I skipped that slide because I would have like many more, but I skipped that slide. What churches can offer is a form of everyday hermeneutics of the experiences of what they see. But I would say less and less in a normative way, this is the truth, and more in a discursive way. What do you experience and what can I bring into, and how can we together make sense of that? So I would say it's a way of religious communication.
Thank you. We go to Ukraine for a question. Yeah. Yeah. Try again.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I am from Ukrainian Catholic University is an educational institution. We have theological faculty, but we have another more faculties. So we hear from our students a very difficult question. When the world is talking about peace in Ukraine, we are talking about justice, peace, through Christian perspective. So my question is, what digital strategies, communication strategies, would you recommend it to talk about such difficult topics, not in Ukrainian audience, but to engage and gain support from other countries from world?
I mean, I'm not a communication specialist, and that would be more a question for communication specialists. I can just tell you what I see. is, I mean, there are always with social media, for example, networks you need to access. And you need to know what's our network we want to access, so we want to reach. For example, what has been done very well is the net, like when it has been 2 years since the murder of, what was her name? Amina in Afghanistan from the police. And they've accessed like a lot of on social media, accessed a lot of like their more feminist networks and political networks to make seen what's going on in in Iran, not Afghanistan, I'm sorry, in the Iran. What's actually, if you want to access like networks or so, it's important to have faces. You need faces because people don't connect to institution, they connect to faces and people. And you need stories. They connect to stories and they connect to pictures and videos. So never underestimate just the message of a picture and of reels, because that becomes much more important than the written out text.
Okay, thank you. One more question, maybe? Yeah, the other side of the room. Is there a microphone?
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was just thinking when I was listening to what? Stand up. No.
I see your head.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking when I was listening to your talk that you were talking a lot about individual experiences and personalized experiences, but an essential part of the Christian spirituality is the sense of community. And I was wondering to what extent this possibility is also a very subtle way to move from this essential part of Christian spirituality to some kind of diluted spirituality in which we lost something that's very important for us. And also a subtle way to fall in a trap that it's to become a spirituality as a private thing, when actually liturgy is a communitary, public expression of faith. So to what extent this is a high risk for us as church, as communities?
Mm-hmm. I mean, one thing first is that the whole individual debate, I mean, that's much stronger in continental Europe and England than it's globally. I mean, there we have more the communal aspect. But I would agree, that's why I said the post-digital perspective is as well a user perspective, because it actually starts with the individual that connects to something where I'm interested or that gives me meaning. That doesn't mean that the whole community thing fall away or fall apart. But that means that community and liturgical forms even are chosen by the individual what they want. What we do see, or what I see, is that people do connect, as with the example of Brot and Liebe, or for me, what was mind-blowing with the research on Insight Timer I'm doing, I'm in one of a multi-religious group that follows one teacher, and then I saw that those people, they meditate every day together. And then last summer they said, oh, let's meet and in person. And then some people from Australia and from the States and so on, they flew all to the area of New York for a retreat. So I mean, the group has 1,000 people, but 30 people traveled around the world to meet there and meditate for 10 days. So we do see that a form of communication always, or not always, but often comes back as well with the influencers. They do create communities as well, but it's often more liquid. And yeah, and it can be bound back to a liturgy. and I mean, it's not that people don't like traditional forms, but sometimes then they look for a digital liturgy, or they come, as I said, as long as it fits, as they follow, but it's easier to unfollow as well. But I would say community is not totally lost, but it's as well change of how community is built and how much people stick to a community or not.
Thank you. We have come to the end of this session. I would like to thank all the questions, and I would like to thank you, Professor Müller, for your thought-provoking contribution to our conference and our learning community. I'm looking forward to the further collaboration in the project, and hopefully if we have a next conference on faith formation in the post-digital world, you will be there in presence, because that's still a bit more interesting, I would say. Okay, so thank you very much.
Wishing you a good rest of the conference, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Okay. I'm looking in the room, and do I see people that are sitting at the tip of their chair because of this, you know, this cliffhanger that we still have? Yeah, the moment has come now that finally I can give the floor to Father Lucio.
You put the